Hello, to lead the last but one of our ice cream series. We are very, very lucky to have a brilliant forum of us. Dr. Kishonna, Associate Professor in Writing, Art, and Vision Studies and Management in University of Kentucky. So you're going to get a different kind of talk from many of the law talks that you will hear today. But I want to see that we have people in the room that haven't really been to our meetings. I'm going to quickly say that if you would like to follow the series, you can ask the and any other speakers. We have a mailing list for the ISP mailing list on which we send a newsletter every Monday saying what events we're going to see, especially your series. If you'd like to subscribe, either drop me or another branch. We're on the ISP website. We would love to have you visit again. And hopefully, I can't promise to produce another Kishonna.
The one and the only.
But we try. We expect from the speakers that it would be lovely to have you again. So without further ado, thank you so much for visiting us.
Thank you.
We're looking forward to your talk.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here. You all are awesome. And also there's plenty of food. So if you need more, go get more. That's not gonna bother me at all. And I also understand that there are schedules happening. So if you have to go or do a thing, that's okay. That's completely okay. Show of hands, let me get a sense of who's in the audience. So my legal scholars. Okay. Okay. My computer science folks, okay? Humanities folks, yeah? Engineering? Who else we got in here? Who else did I not mention? Design folks? Who else is in here? Let me know who you are. Or did everybody raise their hand? Yeah. Okay. I guess I just want to know, usually I just talk my talk regardless of who the audience is. I'm not going to act like I know legal speak. I'm not going to act like I know computer science speak. This is not my lane. But I think it's really important, to have like these kinds of conversations because I do know people. So a little bit of my background, I do ethnography, that's kind of like the method. So ethnography, puts me in spaces with people. It puts me in conversations like with people, I immerse myself into the cultures and the communities that people have like created in a digital space, right? So for my anthropologists who are, there are some anthropologists that are like digital ethnography that is not ethnography. I get it, respect, that's fine. But I also think that, especially with the digital spaces, these are no longer just third places or third spaces. These are real spaces that we occupy. And I thought, as a scholar, especially starting out in the early 2000s, like in this grad work, I thought it was necessary to treat it as a real space and to respect the things that folks were doing inside these spaces. So that's kind of like a little bit of my background. I also need to know who the gamers are in the space. Gamers. What? Hold up. Wait. Professor Kim, where are the gamers? All right. Let me say this again. Where are the gamers? Don't just no. We're not gonna do that. We're not doing that. If you're a gamer, you're a gamer. I don't care what the stigmatized identity is around gamer. Let's reclaim that identity. It is ours. Let me try this again. Who played a game in their phone recently? Okay, thank you. Show of hands, who are the gamers in the room? We all should be raising our hands. If you play any card games, any board games, all those count, all those matter. You're all gamers in this room, right? Took a while to get there. All right, so what am I talking about today? I'm so sorry. I think I used this to kind of advance some slides and stuff. So I really wanted to talk about, voice-based community. So the research that I look at, I'm in the console gaming space. So I don't do a lot of research like in the PC space, but I look at the console spaces and I'm really fascinated with the architecture of the structure in those spaces. So I spent like a long time, thinking about like the diffusions of innovations like in this space and all the changes and how those changes really impacted the culture of the space. and how those changes like really impacted, people's experiences inside there. So my point of entry really is when consoles went live. Now, when I say that, I'm really just talking about Xbox. So no shade to my PlayStation fans in here or my Nintendo Switch users. Those came into the game a lot later, right? But Xbox was really like a pioneer, if you will, inside the online space in console gaming. So Xbox went live in like 2002. And I immediately, I've been a lifelong gamer. I remember being an undergrad. We would have like our LAN parties. Y'all probably don't even know what LAN parties are. My gosh. But before there were these massive networks that could connect us, we kind of just piecemealed together. We always had, some lovely human from computer science that would connect our consoles together and say, hey, let's play Halo, or let's play whatever game, that we were playing. But those were really some fascinating, innovative kinds of spaces. And I don't think, I'm thinking about like the scholarship that we don't have on that. And I really think that that's like a huge miss. There was something that I don't think I put that in this slide, but I remember feeling really seen as a Black gamer, who kind of gamed with my friends, like in a very multiplayer way, that it's not the same. Like, in a physical space with other people. That's what we considered multiplayer. I think some of y'all's generation call that couch co-op. I don't know what that is. But anyway, in this multiplayer way, I remember watching NBA Inside Stuff. And y'all are probably too young to remember that show. But every Saturday morning, Ahmad Rashad would talk about, what was happening like in the sports world for that week. And this one time he featured the San Antonio Spurs. They were on a championship run, and it was like the team that had Tim Duncan. It was like these huge names, like in the 90s, and they were playing StarCraft. And they were playing like on the plane. They were playing their hotel room show. They were always playing. But I remember really feeling valuable and feeling seen because it was the first time that I had saw Black folks in the conversation related to gaming. And usually when we talked about like gaming, especially PC gaming, we were mostly talking about like white men in that space and East Asian men in that space. And we hadn't really seen like any Black and brown folks like inside that space. So it was a really beautiful moment. But what I thought was really interesting is when folks talk about like esports in particular, they often talk about like esports, like, when the league started in like the early 2000s, but they ignore all of the things that we would constitute as like esports before then, right? So like if we were to think about like the definition of like esports, it's like organized competition, like, and nobody really cared about that because competition is just embedded in what most gamers do. That's not what this talk is about. Let me get back to my slides. See, that's why I have to have slides to keep me on track, right? Okay, so Xbox went live in 2002, 360 came out in 2005, and the 360 was when the network connectivity was embedded inside as opposed to like the adapter that you would plug into like a USB kind of port outside. And then PlayStation went online in 2006 and Nintendo Switch, bless them, was like a few years ago. But shout outs to the Switch. The platform and the interface in Xbox has also had like a lot of changes. Now, some people might think that like, oh, an interface, who cares about the interface? Who cares about, that kind of space? But this has actually been a very contentious space. And for the people who like design and make and do, I think this is like really, like you have to think about that. What happens when we roll out these changes? So actually what had happened inside Xbox is that there you had, Major Nelson, he was like the person that would announce all these things like at E3, that's like the big conference, and they would be really excited about all these changes, but there was always fall off at every iteration of change. Now, why was there fall off? So I wrote an article, let me go forward. So I wrote an article and I identified that a lot of the diffusion of innovations really could be seen along the lines of gender, race, class, education, ability. That these things really dictated and dominated the rates of adoption, like of a lot of these technologies. So for instance, if there was like a change in like how you found your friends, you had to go through the different profiles, the different tabs. And so a lot of times that will be like very difficult depending on what iteration this was. But a lot of those changes too. So for some of you might know that theory, others might not. But inside that theory of diffusion of innovation, you have like early adopters. Your early adopters are some of your most privileged folks, the people who have access to the information, the people who have the privilege of being able to decipher that information. And so what I mean by that is like, let's say if there's like a manual or, nowadays it's like a YouTube video and somebody's explaining and doing that. This was like the before times. But before we had those folks on YouTube who were like explaining, a lot of times we just had to like read a manual, or we had like a person who was like a point of contact in the community that would help us like understand like these changes. And so we often would rely on these people to say, hey, what did they say at E3? Because also it wasn't accessible. E3 now, runs on, you can watch it on YouTube, you can watch it. There wasn't that kind of access back then, right? So like all of these changes were happening. And for a large part, like a large chunk of like women, all the changes became just too much for them to like keep up with, especially whenever a lot of the changes in the early 2000s were happening, because it was pretty quick. But one of the other big changes was the incorporation of voice chat. Now, the incorporation of voice chat, this was a huge thing, because before then, how you communicated with people was mostly like text-based, right? So in the PC space, PC had long been doing this way before console. So for those of you who are in PC, you're like, yeah, we know, we've been there, we did that already. All right, we don't care about PC, we care about console. So, but whenever like PC went to voice chat, it was a huge thing to be able to talk to people. So what was the context of some of those early interactions, right? I think that there was a convergence of a lot of people inside those spaces. And I think people just didn't realize there's a lot of people that don't look like me that's inside this space. So immediately there was a lot of trolling, a lot of griefing, a lot of harassment. You can imagine if you spoke and you sounded like a woman, people were asking you to make sandwiches and perform sexual favors. If you were a person who spoke English with an accent, they're engaging in really xenophobic ways. If you sounded black or brown, they're engaging in really racist ways. So that was always that was like the norm in gaming spaces. So what did these platforms do? I'll come back to that one in a second. I'll come back to that one. Let me mention this one. A lot of those changes also set Xbox in particular on a particular path to serve certain communities. So they took away their family package. So let's say, I have a family, I have kids, and then I could have like an Xbox Live, like a package to give me access online. And then we could kind of all go online. They went away from that, and they kind of went more to like this individualistic approach. And I think that a lot of the award systems and the badges kind of are indicative of like, we care about you as an individual, not that collective kind of gaming sphere. So a lot of these changes were directly impacted, the connectivity that a lot of people would have in the space. And then also, this is significant, whenever Xbox converged with social media. I'm not sure if you all like remember something called like Gamergate, but Gamergate was basically like a harassment campaign that the good old boys network and gaming kind of enacted on people who they saw as outsiders and others inside the gaming space. So women were attacked and targeted, queer and trans folks were targeted, folks of color were targeted like during this thing. But something that made them vulnerable and hyper visible was this convergence of the social media inside this space. So for instance, let's say if I do something really good in a game, I post that to Twitter. But also, whenever I post that to Twitter, I'm emitting certain aspects of my identity that would help keep me hidden in a gaming space, because that's not connected. My gamer tag is not connected to like my actual like identity in social media. Once I shared that, those two things were coupled together. So then I would share that, I would post it, and people were like, oh, Kishonna Gray, oh, I see your gamer tag now. And that actually facilitated like a lot of the harassment that a lot of folks saw. Now, this was some of those unintentional kind of like design things, but those are one of the things that happen whenever these social media platforms, whenever gaming converge like with the social media platforms. Now, let me get back to, okay, so a lot of those changes happened. I think a lot of the innovations that kind of took place, they were very intentional about how they were building, what they were constructing, and what they were crafting. The voice space was kind of like a Wild West. And Xbox was like a new frontier inside this. And I say frontier in all the colonial ways that I could muster. I mean, every single one, okay? It really became like a frontier of like, there were some people who they were the first to the frontier, they were the first to settle, and then everybody else, either if there were folks already there, they got pushed aside and pushed away, and then they kind of created like this new kind of toxic space that then became the culture that we know like gaming, right? But so let's get into, let me talk a little bit about, I didn't want to go there. let me get back here. Let me talk about this voice space. So whenever gaming went live, we're talking to people, we can hear how each other sounds. If anybody ever played like console gaming, you know that there's like a phrase or a message that says, this space is not rated. So voice space just became like this Wild West because there was no ability to control it. Well, I had a problem with that. And so for me, I'm like, these are the best and brightest minds who are creating some of the most beautiful technologies that the world has ever seen. And they can't figure out how to observe the voice-based community, right? First, what we learned was that just wasn't true. That wasn't the case. Let me see what that slide is on. I'll backtrack there. Yeah. And so what we found was that there were attempts to moderate the voice space community. So there was a game called Gears of War. I'm not sure if you all know Gears of War, but in this space, there would often be a ghost character that would come into the room. Now, for a long time, folks didn't know who this was. Now, this is probably around the years of like 2008, 2009, 2010, like right when Gears of War came out. So you would be in the room in the party chat, and so this character would come in. It said Marcus entered, so stay a little bit, and then Marcus leaves. Now, Marcus is like the name of like the hero character inside Gears of War. Now, so we went to the Xbox forums, because remember, we didn't have social media to go to at the time. So we went to the forums, and we were looking for who is this Marcus that comes in. And so there were a lot of like wild conspiracy theories about who that was. But I think the one that I latched onto that made the most sense, and actually it made sense to what me and my gamer friends saw. This was the administrators of the space, somebody in Microsoft going into a space and like observing the chat in the space. It probably was like an automated system that was probably going in and like recording, just recording and sending that data back somewhere. Now, Microsoft has never confirmed or denied this. They have never spoken to this, right? But what kind of led us to this understanding is because a couple years later, they incorporated this really cool technology, basically called Xbox Record That. And it became Cortana. Some of you might be familiar with like the Cortana system inside that. So this was like the precursor. Some of you might could care less about games. Probably could care less about games. What I hope to impart to people is that if we paid more attention to what's happening in the gaming space, we could offset some of the things that we will experience later. So I put Xbox Record That, and I put this voice recognition challenges under that as well, because later, Kinect came out in 2009. Much later, we recognized that we had a lot of problems like with voice-based technologies, right? Similar conversations around the Kinect. So the Kinect, really cool, came out in 2009, 2010, it was really innovative. So the Kinect, for those of you who are not familiar with the Kinect is a camera that basically reads your body. And their catchphrase for Xbox was, your body becomes the controller. So instead of like using the controller to game, there were games that were created where you could just kind of move your body. A lot of sports games, a lot of interactive kinds of games. So it was like real cute. It was a real cute era. But the problem was the Kinect couldn't read everybody in the same way. Okay, so this is a really cute quote. I'll read it here. So let's see. Oh, I can't see the top. That's in the way. You bought a Kinect, right? Yeah, but I can't play it. Why is that? It's racist. Oh, you're one of those folks that's not recognizing because of your skin tone. No, because I'm a human. It hates people, you freaking colorist. So they're being funny, but basically what like a lot of people were saying was like that the darker your skin was, the harder it was to read. Now, so for me, I'm a social scientist. I'm like, let's experiment that. So we bought a whole bunch of Kinects. I'll leave that up there. I'll read it in a second. So, we bought some Kinects. We plugged it in. It was during summer. So like my summer school students, they were like, hey, you're going to be my research subjects right now. You didn't have anybody else. It's Eastern Kentucky. There weren't that many people. So they did it. So the nature of summer school, you only go to summer school if you can pay for summer school, right? So these is not most people can't pay for summer school because it's expensive. So it was my student athletes who were there. So it was largely members of the football team, Black dudes, right? So I had all these Black dudes that were coming through. They were doing the Kinect, wouldn't scan, wouldn't see them, wouldn't scan. Now, there was an article that came out that said, no, the Connect's not racist. It's your problem. You don't have enough light in your room. That was like the thing that I think Consumer Report or like Business Insider, they actually did their own little study and had a couple people. They said, look, our best friends who are Black, it sees them perfectly, right? Now, so I was like, okay, that's fine. Now, the social sciences in me, I had to go through. I'm like, how many people did you do? It was really just a couple. It was literally their friends who they worked with, and they did a couple people, and they said, no, there's no problems here. So I was like, let's go along with the lines that, the lighting is the problem, right? And I think that's what I posted here. They found, the folks who did this, they said, it's the low light level issue. The webcams were having like issues like around that time. And so a lot of us just agreed, if we want these cameras to see us, if we want the better quality, we have to have like good lighting. I wasn't satisfied like with that answer, right? Because we did different lighting conditions. We turned the lights down low, and still even darker skinned folks couldn't be read. We changed even tops and shirts. We had folks that had white shirts on, folks that had like darker shirts on. And still, and it was harder, especially it was really bad. Like it didn't even recognize like a person, like if they had like a dark shirt on and it wasn't reading like their darker skin. And so and then here somebody, it was always some folks that would say, well, actually, Kishonna, you don't know anything about it. I'm like, okay, well, come on in here and like see the things that like we've tested, right? But I did a keynote at Kai. That might be some of y'all's space, but I did the keynote last year at Kai, and I had this really lovely human being. I don't mean lovely at all, but this really lovely human being that came up to me to explain to me what the science was. And so basically, he was like, well, Kishonna, let me tell you how the technology works. Basically, whenever it would render your body, there has to be the light and dark contrast, right? This is computer science stuff. I don't know anything about that. I'm like, okay, cool. And I was like, the question that I said, I was like, did you all test this with Black people? No, that's not necessary. I'm like, so if you didn't test it with Black people, then you're talking out your ass right now. Then you have no idea what then that the interface would have done, like to render like their bodies. Like you would have had no idea, because basically that early testing, a lot of the testing, it's most the privileged bodies who are in those spaces, who have access to those spaces, and women are not in there. Bigger bodies are not in there. People with darker skin, they're just not in those spaces. But I think that what was significant about the Connect, and I really wish a lot of like my colleagues then would pay more attention, but they just didn't care. They're like, oh, Kishonna, that's gaming. We could have like really offset a lot of the conversations that then came later. The bias in facial recognition technology, right? Now, that's not the point of like this conversation or this talk. We know that there are problems with it. I'm even thinking about like a lot of cities have like deployed these kinds of technology. So for instance, like in Detroit, Project Greenlight, inside there, they have like these cameras that are using this facial recognition technology, but it can't decipher or distinguish Jamal from Jerome. It can't decipher or distinguish Muhammad from Abdul. It can't see the different kinds of faces inside those spaces. And so here you have basically, it's just racial profiling. It's a lot of this racial bias. And again, there are scholars who are talking more about it, but this is just like one of those examples where I wish we would have paid more attention like to gaming, because we could have like addressed like a lot of those things inside that space, right? Let's see, Xbox record that. Oh yeah, so what kinds of conditions did a lot of these issues then create, right? So we created like this default user inside gaming spaces, just like we've created like the default user inside technological spaces. There's this default Western, standard American English, no accents. Like you have to really speak a certain way to really engage inside the voice recognition space, and you have to look a certain way. Now there have been patches and updates, but I think a lot of the harm has been done because what story did this tell people? This told people, I am not a part of the community. I do not belong. I'm not wanted here in this space. So there was like a huge exodus of like a lot of people like outside gaming. But now, because of these technologies are embedded in everything that we do now, we can't just escape it, right? It's a part of us, even going through airports, the technology is using us, the imaging like is like scanning us, and it's not inclusive. It's very ableist, it's transphobic, so all of these things are still like a problem that we have to like interact and engage with. Let's get back to the moderation piece. I'm gonna talk to my lawyers in here, my budding lawyers and scholars. Anytime I gave you all the context of what the voice space community looks like. It's very problematic if you don't sound a certain way. So I framed this under this framework of like linguistic profiling. That's not mine. It's the scholar John Ball. John Ball did this study back in the 80s in the city of Chicago, where they used linguistic profiling was basically used as a tool to decide who was going to get loans, who would get home loans, who would get car loans. And so they basically were profiling people. So in a way that the automated systems are still very biased, they actually utilized, how they would do callbacks for people who applied for these loans. And they said, oh, that sounds like somebody who speaks with an accent. They're not going to get this loan. They sound Black. They're not going to get this loan. That's a woman. She has no husband. She's not going to get this loan. So a lot of those things are still embedded into the automated systems that then a lot of the issues that we have now, especially for apartment seeking, still home buying, a lot of these things kind of just fed into that, right? So if we get like into the voice chat space, right, all these things are happening. I remember asking a question whenever there was a really bad, in my first book, Race, Gender, and Deviance in Xbox Live, I kind of outlined what some of the conversations look like, so if I should have brought it in here because some of you might not be familiar with my work, but, once people find out that like I'm a Black woman, they're like, oh, where are your crack babies? Go get your welfare check. I'm like, oh, wow, you're hurting my feelings. Okay, come on, let's just go beat these people. Okay, let's just go fight. But I really thought that the stakeholders in the space, the platform, would have had much better a much better hold on the conditions of the space. But I remember having a conversation once, Xbox started answering my call. They ignored me mostly for the most part. They had no idea about the extent of the problems in the space. And it was so bad that Xbox had released a statement that said, racism is not a problem on our network. I'm like, halfway. Well, how you figure that? But they were going by the quantitative data. They were looking at the player reports that were filed in the space to say, hey, we're looking at the reports and people are not filing reports on racism in the space. I had to tell them, I was like, there is nowhere in the reporting system where people can file reports on racism. And they're like, what do you mean? I was like, open up the reporting system. So I went through it with somebody and there was not a space to report racism. And they said, oh, no, it's right here. But it was couched under this, it wasn't even hateful speech at the time. It was couched under like something with communication, like problematic communication. It was framed in a really interesting way. I'm like, most people who want to explain what's happening to them aren't going to use that kind of language. If somebody's called an N-word, they're like, that's racist, and they're going to look for that framing. Even to this day, I don't think that Xbox has actually put that word in there. So then you have to be savvy enough to know how to navigate the reporting system. In addition to, there are layers to the reporting system. Sorry, I'm talking to my computer scientists and my design folks again. I'm gonna get back to my lawyers soon, I promise. But anyway, but I think that you have to design systems in a way where they're user friendly, because if you don't, then that's sending a certain valuation. You're letting your user base know that they don't care about that thing. And it was only after Gamergate where a lot of these platforms implemented gender-based discrimination. So we do have that. Luckily, I'm glad they did that, but they had to. But we have a place where it says, hey, are you experiencing, communication, based like discrimination based on your gender? You can file that report here. So that lets users know that they care about that. They have put value in protecting folks around that. And so, but the same needs to be seen on the other end, right? And so I remember having other kinds of conversations. And I said, why is it such a problem at banning people in these gaming systems? They let me know, I'm not going to name the company, I signed NDA with these people. Damn. But this company said, Kishonna, if we banned the offenders in this space, we wouldn't have gamers. Like, what? Wait a minute. I was like, I need to see the numbers. I'm like, what are you saying to me right now? They have, in this particular game, now at the time it was a smaller community, so they were collecting a lot of data. The larger communities, have stopped collecting the data on it, because then you have just captured all this stuff and then you don't know what to do with it. There's nothing that you're doing with it. So a lot of these platforms are not invested at identifying the extent of a lot of these problems. Let me just say that. But in this particular community, they said, first, they're all cheating. So if we ban them all, like they're all cheating. And it's mostly PC space, right? It's not just console. It's a little bit harder to cheat in console, much easier like in PC. I appreciate you all being here. Thank you. Y'all take care. Thank you so much. And so, it's very much like a PC problem where like all these mods, all the things that people can do. They said cheating is a huge problem. So we really can't do much about it, right? And then they said like trolling and racism, like that's just the kind of speech that is normal, like to the platform. They said, so everybody's saying the N-word. And then they also, in that moment, they let me know that they had been recording voice-based interactions. And at this time, they're like, no, we don't have the technology or the tools. We don't have the capacities to do that, but they had been doing it. And they did it right when they implemented the Cortana system, the Xbox Record that. They had the tools then, but they were like, we didn't know what we would capture. So we don't know what to do with this, right? The other issue with my legal scholars. Like in my mind, I'm like, I don't care nothing about none of that. Ban them all, get them all out of here. They're like, Kishonna, they have protections in this space. If they say this, they have First Amendment protections. I'm like, Cap, that's a lie? They're like, no, Kishonna, what do you mean? I was like, what, are y'all serious? Like, I was really bothered. I'm like, you are really assigning the First Amendment protections inside this community where we all have to sign up for terms of service and we all have to agree. You have given us pages and pages and pages of documents of things that I have to abide by once I'm inside this space. There are certain, I went line for line. I'm like, I can't do this. We can't do that. If I do this, you're going to kick me out. I'm like, so this is not a space that has First Amendment protections. First, it's a private space. Let's just start there. And so that's why I'm like, did legal tell you this? Like, I really want to know who told you this. But I realized that was the scapegoat to not have to do anything about it. Because if they did do something about it, then the gamer base, the users would actually be saying, you're violating our rights. You're violating these things. And they wanted to avoid the headaches associated with that. I don't know what to do with that argument. Like I said, like for me, I'm not a lawyer. I would love to hear from the lawyers in the room to help me like really figure out like this kind of conversation. But it also like let me know that the folks who are like most impacted, it's such a small group of people and they just aren't really, they just don't care, right? So that's one of the things. What other kinds of things that have they attempted like at moderation? And let me know how I am for time. Is that clock right back there? Okay, I'll stop so I can hear. I want to hear from you lovely human beings like in this room. One of the other things that had happened, there was a time where they were like, okay, we're going to have zero tolerance for racism in the space. I was like, okay, what does that mean? You just can't say the N-word. I was like, okay. They had already deployed this. They didn't ask my opinion. Let me say that. It was after the fact. Let me tell you how I got to this space. I was playing the game Friday the 13th. Y'all know Friday the 13th. Please tell me y'all at least know. Okay, Jason, right? Okay. So it's a really cool game. And basically it's a replica of the movie Friday the 13th. So where you're Jason or you're a counselor and then, he just hacks and slashes everybody, like, so it's fantastic. It's great. So I was playing this game and I happened into a room. So some of the other diffusions of innovation, something that was really cool that Xbox did, they created an option where you could look for people to play with, kind of like to help with the matchmaking, like capabilities and abilities. Matchmaking is something that's a big challenge. One of the things that they tried to do before, they tried to do matchmaking along the lines of like a reputation. So basically people would be assigned a reputation score and this went just as bad as you could imagine. So basically in their mind, they were like, okay, we'll put the toxic people over here by themselves. And then everybody else is over here. I'm like, okay, that's not going to work. You can't do that, right? But they tried this. And so a lot of gamers, and it was assigned like a color, red, yellow, green. You all should look up Xbox reputation system. It was really wild. It was an epic fail. It really was. So, but basically, they really thought that the toxic people would be in one space and everybody else, we'd have, we'd have a happy time, right? People learn how to weaponize that reputation system. So let's say if there was a woman who beat a dude in the space, then people would flood would flood the reporting system to lower her reputation. So you had a lot of women who were really good at the game inside this supposed like toxic space, like with these other folks. Black people, if you were mad at this black dude and, said something about your mama or something, I don't know, but then, they would weaponize the tool and they would report. If there were kids and they didn't want to play with kids, they would report. And so here you had everybody who had a terrible reputation. We're all still in that space together, right? And this was like I think it was like the precursor before they identified like different kind of gamer zones of where they were like, okay, are you going to play casually? Okay, we'll put you there. Are you hardcore? We'll put you here. But even still, the top levels of like competition are in the hardcore space. So like for me, I don't want to just be beating kids all day long in the game. I'm like, no, I'm gonna go in there, so I can play competitively. So they have been trying to figure it out, but because they're not talking to people who got sense about how you design these things, they're still engaged in epic failures along these lines. So let me get back. Okay, Friday the 13th, I'm playing, looking for groups, looking for chats. So there was, the feature that you could implement keywords or these hashtags, and you could identify people like to play with. So let's say we wanted like women's only space. We could do that. We can go play, right? There was this hashtag that said, hashtag make Crystal Lake great again. Make Crystal Lake great again. So around 2017, right after it was like 2016, 2015. So hashtag MAGA, the election of like Donald Trump. So a lot of the Trumpism had like embedded inside the gaming space. So people were implementing this hashtag to say, hey, we're like-minded folks in here, you come on in. So the ethnographer in me, I was like, you got to check that out. Let me go in there, right? So I go in there, I'm like, what are they doing? And also I'm able to hide mostly because I speak with standard American English. People think I'm a little white kid in the space. So I use that to my advantage. I'm not gonna lie. I probably should be putting that in the IRB. I haven't. Oh my gosh, it's recorded. I shouldn't tell that. People think like I'm a white dude in the space. So I'm able to like get by. I'm like, hey guys, what are we doing in here? So basically they fill me in. They fill me in and tell me what's happening. So they basically said the plan is we're going to play part 2 Jason. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Friday the 13th universe. Part 2 Jason is the one that has the pillowcase on his head. So they're using that as like clan member Jason. So Jason's like a clan member, and he's going to kill all the women and the folks of color and in the space. So, we go, so as I'm playing and watching this, there's Bugsy, black dude, we go and kill him. Deborah, Asian woman, we go and kill her. Chad, Jewish dude, we go kill him. So it's really all this awful, ugly violence, right? And I'm like, well, I'm fascinated by that. So then we play several rounds of this. I get a sense of why they're doing it. And then somebody finds out, they're like, wait a minute, no, she's black, y'all. She's not one of us. Like this was like several days. It wasn't just immediate. It was like several days because I was just in there, just kind of like, scoping all this out. And so basically they call me the N-word inside the chat. I was like, why you call me the N-word? At this point, I'm not bothered. None of this bothers me. It's bad that we've been so desensitized to it, and it should bother me, but it is what it is. And so basically, you can call me the N-word, and then they kick me out the room. And then so I send a message and I type it out. I'm like, why did you call me the N-word? And I spelled it out. I was banned immediately. So I'm like, oh, what's happened? I didn't know what was happening. Then I got an email from the enforcement, Xbox enforcement. They'll send you a message, say, hey, there have been actions reported. You did something wrong. It's not really clear. It's not transparent at all. Something else that I hope that these platforms do. We need a lot more transparency. But anyway, I didn't know what happened. And so there's no number 2 enforcement. I can't get a sense. So I went to Twitter, the best tool that we had at the time. I go and I pop off on Twitter. And so I get a message, I get DM'd by somebody who's like part of like enforcement. And they were like, Kishonna, we're so sorry. We'll fix this right now. Can you take your post down? Because like, right then, I'm like, what you mean? I'm like, y'all have not hired me. I'm not under NDA like with y'all. So I'm like, wow, because basically what I said is like, there's some kind of algorithm that is crawling and strolling through here and identifying things and I knew that because when I typed out the N-word, there was a perma ban. Now, a few conversations later, many months later, I'm in a room with some of these folks and I tried to understand. I was like, so we do have some kind of moderation happening. What does that look like? So one of the things that I found out was that there was like an Instaban zero tolerance for like racism, and they had narrowly defined racism as utterance of the N-word, right? And I was like, you do realize, well, I'm guessing there was nobody at the table who said this might disparately impact Black folks who use the N-word in their everyday communication practices, right? Because there was also like a group of Black folks that were like, we're getting banned. We don't know why. They were being banned because they were just doing regular talking, their regular speech practices and patterns with other Black folks in the space. But because they had a zero tolerance for the N-word, the system did not distinguish that. The system didn't distinguish that. And I know I'm running out of time. I want to make sure to, one of the other things that I realized is a problem. So that was back in, 2016, 2017. I'm a part of a team who's been, doing stuff, I can call them out, even though, they're the folks at Modulate, they have this product called ToxMod, where they basically are doing machine learning to try to tackle toxicity online. And one of the things that I found myself doing, I never thought I would be doing in my professional life, is basically teaching a computer all the utterances of like an N-word, to be able to tell them, oh, this is how a white person might say it. This is how Black people might say it. It's weird and wild, and I can't get used to it. One of the other things that we were just talking about was like the system couldn't distinguish Arnold Schwarzenegger's last name from like the N-word. And so it was being pinged like in these I'm like, oh my gosh, the machine's not that smart, isn't it? So I think that it's like some of those challenges that we still have that we have to think about. What all are we feeding this machine, right? When I think about like the worlds that AI is going to create and the worlds that AI is going to build, do we want it to be able to? So for me, I'm thinking like, do I want it to be able to replicate Blackness? Do I want it to be able to do Blackness well? Do I want my Alexa to be able to understand the ways, my Southern Black draw and the Southern Black twang and Appalachian accent? Like, do we want that? I'm like, yes, we do. But then what's the process that's actually involved in doing that? And I'm very uncomfortable with that process, right? Because like in my mind, I'm like, we're just going to be sitting here and saying it and capturing all the different ways that we can, just so we can feed it to a machine, right? And that was also one of the things that I was very uncomfortable with, because, especially with the AI generated like bodies, diverse bodies that AI is doing. I remember like just sitting with a team and just kind of finding all the different types of like Black hair and just feeding it to a machine. And then it's just spitting out all these beautiful things. And I'm like, how I feel about that. So that's some of those ethical things that I'm still sitting with, because I really don't have like a language for it. Yeah, so that's like, what are we teaching the algorithm to actually do, right? And then so what are some of those, kind of challenges there? I'll stop there. I'm not sure what else is there. Oh, Tay, you all remember Tay? My gosh, I can't with Tay, bless her. Yeah, I'll end there. I appreciate you all. Y'all are lovely human beings. Thank you so much for taking time. Appreciate y'all. And I took up some of the Q&A time. My apologies. So I know folks do have class, so it's absolutely okay. If folks have to get to class, that's okay. Do we have to leave the space? I think that's what I wanted to ask. Okay. So let's just have, if you got to go, that's cool, but feel free to ask some questions or comments or concerns, or if anybody's going to solve these problems, I would love to hear it, because I'm looking for it. The world needs y'all, by the way. Let me just say that. Yes. Do you mind sharing your name?
Fernando.
Fernando, how you doing?
Great. So I was thinking about my game is StarCraft. So
yeah,
it's an old game. It has a community that was built in a certain way. And I think a huge part of moderation within this space comes from their own players.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So for example, if you do certain things, it would be just unspeakable.
Yeah.
Probably not racist. Exactly.
Sure.
But if you top down without saying good game, that's like you're out.
Right.
So I was wondering, besides moderating these spaces, whether you have thought about ways in which these companies can incentivize self-moderation within the community, maybe approaching some leaders within the gaming community.
Absolutely.
I don't know, some ways in which maybe you can attract the first crowd that you attract
Yeah.
But also gets the legitimacy for being better at the game.
Yeah.
Have certain features and so on. So
Absolutely. No, I love that question because I think that's one of the things that like I contend with. I'm like, I could really care less about spending time punishing people for offenses inside the game. Like, I don't want to do that. I don't want people banned. I don't want that. I'm like, so for me, some of the questions that I'm asking now is like, how can we create the conditions for a pro-social environment, right? And so just like the things that you mentioned, and, we love to hear a good game at the end of a game, no matter how it went. We want to hear that. But what are some of those other things that can be built into the environment that kind of facilitates this pro-social environment? Gamers love badges and rewards and trophies, right? So like, give them more of that. They like to be like rewarded for like engaging in like, this behavior that, that leads to that. But I think one of the things I look at, so in League of Legends, tribunals. I'm not sure if folks like played League of Legends. Do you all remember the tribunals that they had? So let me tell you all about the tribunals. So the tribunal was like, hey, we don't want folks punished. We want them to be better, right? So they implemented basically this jury of your peers of like, if you offended the space in any way, then you would have to come before like this group of people, the tribunal, and then they would say, hey, you did this thing. It's not okay for these reasons. But this is how you can make it better, whether it's like an apology or they sent them like resources to like learn, like, okay, that's homophobic speech. This is why, to try to like help them like get better at it. But the problem is like the level of scale. I don't know how big StarCraft is, but I know a lot. It's a big community now, right? It's huge. Yeah, absolutely. So these communities are huge. So whenever we're talking to these platforms, they're trying to think about how do we scale this up? And when they say scale up, they want to know how can we automate it, right? So then it goes back to the problem of like, how do we teach these machines to be able to do like that level of tribunal, right? So let's say if somebody like, but also the problem with a lot of these platforms, they don't want to be transparent enough. They're not transparent at all. And then I've tried to figure out like, what's the fear behind that, and I've never gotten like an answer, but I just assume that you think that somebody's like going to steal your IP. I don't even know if that's the right thing to say, but I'm like, you don't have to explain the behind the scenes, but just explain your processes. But they just won't do that. And like for me, I think if we could get past that part of the conversation, because I think a lot of folks we would respect these platforms if they operate in a good faith and a good effort of trying to do something, right? If they tried to do something about the sexism in the space, if they tried to do something about the racism, if they tried to do something about the pathways of like grooming, that happens in a lot of these spaces, or the pathways to like radicalization that happens a lot. If they just let us know that, hey, we're trying, we acknowledge these things are happening in the world, we don't know how to fix it, but we're trying, they won't even do that. Like a lot of them like won't even acknowledge it. And so many of these companies, they stopped even collecting data on it. And I assume that it was because of like the liability issue. So for instance, like in Discord, like I remember there was like a conversation like in Discord of where there were some young people in there. They were exposed to probably some things that were unsafe for children, a lot of grooming practices, and and then somebody said they don't want to be liable, like if something were to happen to like a child in that space, right? Or like if they were contributing to like trafficking, or if they were contributing like in those ways. So essentially a lot of these platforms have taken like a hands-off approach because of the legal liability of it. So if you acknowledge like, yes, this is a problem, then you then have to acknowledge like a lot of other things that go in it. I see my legal scholars shaking their heads. I feel like, I would love to hear from them, like, but I feel like it's the liability issue. And so they would just rather not do anything. And I mean, I don't know. There are other people who could probably speak better to that in the space. Yeah. But I guess I just wish we would think about how can we create pro-social spaces and start there, as opposed to like a punishment, like a deficit model, and saying we got to punish these bad actors in the space. Thank you so much. Appreciate you. Yes.
I am not very game literate, so I hope you can grab some
All right.
kind of question out.
Sure. Sure.
I'm really interested in like secondary spaces.
Yeah.
Like Twitch.
Yeah.
I'm curious how these theories like map onto those spaces.
Oh, Twitch. Oh, Twitch.
But this is too outside.
No, it's right inside the area. It's right there. We can talk about Twitch. Do you remember the hate raids that were happening? That's okay. So the hate raids, like this, it's a phenomenon that happens. So what happens, let's say we're all streaming, I'm playing a game, I'm streaming that game on Twitch. And then I'm like, okay, I'm done with my stream. We're all gonna go to Professor Kim's room. Professor Kim is streaming right now. He's playing some Call of Duty. I feel like that's not your game of choice, but we're gonna give you Call of Duty. He's streaming Call of Duty. We're gonna go to Professor Kim's room. So when we go in there, we could engage in bad behavior of where we troll and harass your followers and your user base. That basically is a hate raid of where we have the intentions of going to the space and being bad actors and harassing Professor Kim because we don't like Professor Kim for whatever reason. So what has happened in this space is that hate raids targeted prominent women in the gaming space, queer and trans folks in the gaming space, and a lot of folks of color inside these spaces. Now, these folks would go in with their large following, like thousands and thousands of like gamers would then just go and be in the space, contributing to really toxic environments. Twitch did nothing. Twitch did nothing. But this wasn't the first time that platforms did nothing. Even during Gamergate, so many vulnerable populations had to piecemeal protections because at that time, we couldn't disable comments. There were no bots to filter out certain, practices and activities. Like a lot of the things that we see on these platforms that are contributing to trust and safety, like the trust and safety teams, these were mostly Black and brown women who had to do something to protect the communities. And then these companies basically said, oh, we should implement that this should be a practice of ours. A lot of people don't talk about that. One of the beautiful things associated with the hate raids is that a lot of women in particular, they got really coordinated on social media. So they would go online. There was like, okay, a hate raid is happening, in Professor Kim's room. We got to go in there and protect Professor Kim. So we would go and love bomb essentially to kind of counteract that because the platforms weren't doing anything. That's the example of Twitch that really makes me think about that. But something else related to Twitch is that Twitch is such a visible space. So in the text-based community, you can hide aspects of your identity because you're just texting. And if you don't admit anything, sometimes, some people kind of text how they talk, and then we can kind of say, oh, they're from the Midwest, oh, bless their hearts. There's some telltale signs about where some folks are from based on how, they might type. So there was less space admitted about who you are. Voice-based community, maybe you can hide or mask, how you talk. Maybe you can use some of the tools to kind of distort your voice, in the PC space. But for a lot of us, whenever we speak, we are admitting certain things about our identity. In the streaming community, especially when you're looking at the visuals, we see who you are. We can see you. And then people react and they lash out in certain ways. And I don't think the platforms were really ready for that level of harassment that would come. One thing happened, especially during Black History Month. Twitch used to do really good about featuring Black folks during Black History Month, or Latino Heritage Month. They would feature Latinx folks, or all Women's History Month. They would feature women. But the platform wasn't ready for the amount of harassment that would come whenever they made these folks hyper visible in that way. And so basically, instead of doing anything about it, this past Black History Month, we didn't see any Black folks on the main page. Women's History Month, March, we didn't see any women up there. Indigenous History Month, we didn't see any indigenous gamers up there. And they had been committed to doing that, but because they couldn't do anything about the harassment in the space, they stopped doing it. So I think it's just one of those things of where, these platforms, if they can't quickly find a solution, then they'll go the other way and they just won't do anything. That's my take on Twitch. Yes.
Do you have thoughts on how to incentivize people who are trying to maybe fall short of the goal of achieving this? Because in some cases, I think what you were saying earlier is that by not collecting data or by not acknowledging it, we just pretend, oh, we don't know about it or we don't know how to solve it. And you it almost accidentally incentivizes people who are even trying.
Yeah.
Where there's visibility brought by making an effort to fall short.
Yeah.
It made some progress, but now didn't get there. Yeah. And unfortunately, those are a bit backwards of what we would hope to see.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know. Do you have thoughts on?
I have no idea. I really don't know what to do in this space, because I don't think that enough of these platforms will take enough time to get a sense of what the problems are in the space. So I remember being in these rooms, in these spaces, and they want to figure out, like, why is this happening? They don't really want to know why it's happening. They put people like you in the room to figure out how can we do something about it. But if we don't have enough knowledge about the origins of it, then we're going to continue to have like this repeat problem. Like, it's going to keep coming back. And so I wish that there was like a space where we could just have like a reading week, where they did the reading, to understand like the ethics behind it, understand really like what racism actually is, and what sexism actually is, and how platforms like facilitate that. Like, I really want folks, like, I had a whole reading list, Ruha Benjamin was on it, Sophia Noble, Andre Brock, these beautiful folks who have contributed like to these conversations in beautiful ways, but they won't do like any of the reading. And that's why I was like, okay, all of you human beings, like inside these spaces, you went to these lovely schools, you went to the MITs of the world and the Yales of the world and the Harvards of the world. Well, let's get this shit in the curriculum then, you know what I'm saying? Let's put it on the curriculum to make sure that, let's say if you've got this computer science degree, you have an engagement with these kinds of things. It's in the reading. Or if you have this legal or this law degree, you have the engagement, with these critical conversations that you need to have. And I just don't think that there's like enough of that happening, because like, I'm like, we can't do anything about it, like on the tech side or the platform side, like after the fact. Then I'm like, let's prep them while they're getting their lovely degrees from those fancy schools so they can go in there and be better folks in the world. So that actually happened. The company I mentioned, Modulate, I remember whenever I was at MIT, there was a student there, Mike Pappas. So he was a student. He read my book because it was on the syllabus. And then he was like, oh my gosh, Kishonna, we're creating this thing. And like, your work is like central to like what we're building and creating. Can you help us like do it right? I'm like, that's what we want. That's what we want. And I don't see like another way like around that. People are just going to have to like do the hard work and do the tough work. And also like, there's like, a lot of these platforms are very tech solutionists. Like, we can solve this with some technology, but we have to realize like the technology is like influenced by, human actors, our biases are embedded in that. So many people don't get that. I was shocked to learn that so many people still think that like technology is neutral. Like, how do we get past that conversation? So we're still like at 101 with like a lot of these kinds of conversations, but we don't have enough time to fix it because harms are happening now. So like for me, I'm just like, I'll accept harm reduction. How can we just reduce the harms then? How can we just kind of make people safer, Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Yes.
So one is, thank you for this. I don't think I realized the degree to which the social media platform, the moderation debate is actually lagging behind the gamer regulation debate. I'm fascinated because all the stuff that you were throwing out, right? First Amendment, and like we will start a ban, but we won't tell Facebook and stuff. I did not hear that.
That's okay.
Like literally the same.
Yeah.
I'm interested in. So Facebook was eventually forced to change. I think in parts because some people said that like content moderation is the product for them, and so it also brought them a lot of attention. And so my question part is, are the incentives different when we're talking about gaming? Because like Facebook is basically like, everyone come on our platform because we want to collect your data and then things with it. And so is that for how gaming the thing? I think this is like super broad ranging, and I think that you got into it a little bit when you were discussing the rates. But with the metaverse coming, I feel like these will
the metaverse.
How do you think that's gonna go?
The metaverse is interesting. No shade to Facebook or Meta, but the metaverse has been here. It's been in gaming. So when they take their cues, like a lot of their cues are taking from gaming, from Second Life, from Sims, from all these beautiful things that gamers have like really created, so I had to laugh at these conversations around the metaverse. I'm like, you're creating what? And it's not even as good as gaming, right? So I'm trying to be professional here, but it's a little hater, and me telling me it's not even as good as like what they've created in gaming. But I want to get to the first thing that you asked. Now, I remember being asked like this question, especially as all the things that are happening like in gaming and how gaming, could, I often say the canary in the coal mine, I'm from coal country, like in Kentucky. So I often have a lot of coal mining like language, like in my everyday speak, but it's like gaming was the canary in the coal mine. But because there was not like a critical mass of folks in there, sure, there are large communities, but Facebook was larger. Social media is larger. And also that it's easier to see the anatomy and the architecture of social media because everything you do is right there. It's visible, how you post and, upload videos, upload content, all those things are there. It's not as easy to see. Thank you all so much. It's not as easy to see in a gaming space. Gaming spaces are private, they're hidden, and so not many people understand it. So we kind of ignore it and we don't really pay that much attention to it. So I think that's where like much of the problem is that people don't get it. And also if we think about like conversations around gaming in the public sphere, it's moral panic still. Oh, games are causing violence. I'm like, y'all still talking about that? Like, has the conversation not elevated? And that's what we're still having like basic conversations because these folks don't understand what gaming is, and they haven't done the reading to understand. Well, no, that's actually not true. Other kinds of conversations could happen. I wish they would talk about maybe the desensitization like effects of like gaming and what that might do. But I think that so many people don't understand it. And a lot of folks, because everybody's like a user, there was a time everybody was on Facebook. And so that was part of the conversation because most people like were there and it was easier to see. And it was easier to also see how like the algorithm like worked in that space. It was easier to see those kinds of things, but it's a bit more difficult inside the gaming space just because of the architecture like of the space behind it. That's what I'm thinking. Yeah, yes.
Thank you so much. So you bring up moral panics, which kind of I think hints at the question I want to ask.
Yeah.
Throughout this, this was so helpful. You brought up sort of a parallel issue in the regulation of these platforms, consoles, which is grooming. And so thinking about when I teach the history of communications technology, we sort of talk about how the sort of moral panic of strangers online propel a lot of these early debates. But what I'm interested in here is like, it seems like there's a potential for, capture or things to go more in the direction of those sorts of protections.
Yeah.
And you're more traditional solutions, personal solutions.
Yeah.
So I just want to hear more about that potential risk of sort of feeding into more role.
Absolutely. The one time I got invited to the White House, it was a Zoom call to the White House office, it wasn't like really at the White House. But the one time I got invited to one of those conversations was when it was on some senator's radar that like, oh, games are radicalizing people. Wait a minute. Kids are not safe in gaming. So it was protection around children that actually got them like around that conversation. So we all, we had talking points, we had things that we wanted to say. And basically they tried, they had like their little law clerk or whoever was there that was trying to help us with our questions. I didn't realize there was like a whole science behind the kinds of questions you can even ask our elected officials. I was like, I want to ask the question I want to ask. I want to submit the statement that I want to submit. But they had an idea already, and all of our information had to be fed through this narrow idea and this narrow scope in which they wanted to understand the harms of gaming, and the harms of gaming were impacting children, right? So in my mind, I'm like, that's not the conversation here. I'm not doing that. And so basically none of my questions made it. I didn't get through. I was still in the space, but none of those conversations like got there because I'm like, because when you look at the numbers, that's actually not a huge number. And because I had saw the numbers, like, the grooming of children, sure, the possibility can happen. The trafficking of children, like in the game, okay. But it was the moral panic that was running that because the numbers just didn't justify the energy that we were putting into that. What was this other stuff? I'm like, there are some other harms happening, and then they didn't want to engage in that because that's mostly like a lot of harms like to adults, the harassment campaigns, the kind of the racial violences. And also something else I wanted to talk about was like when we talk about like the radicalization piece, kind of like that from gaming to alt-right and YouTube. I'm like, that was more of like a conversation that we could have had that they didn't want to have either, because that was like, I thought that was a part of it. But then that kind of got stripped away, approaching like to the conversation. They didn't want to talk about white supremacy. They didn't want to talk about like any of that, like inside the space. It just became children are being groomed in gaming. And that's what the headline then like became after that. Yeah. So I don't know. I'm not versed in that. And I'm not polished around the edges, if you can tell. And I play a game in that way. I don't know how, because also there's so much more pressing things to do. And I just feel like, at least, my question still got submitted on record, it's there. So if anybody, wanted to, they could see what I tried to do to kind of propel that conversation forward still. It just didn't happen. And they were done. I think something else happened and then they were done with that. I can't remember what happened, but gosh, I wish I could remember. But basically, the news cycle, that had ended. That's out of the news, and we were on to something else by then. But that's also the problem. We don't have this sustained energy to kind of have these deep conversations that we actually have to have around these kinds of things. These aren't just one-off conversations. Now a policy could help and impact, but if the policy is not influenced by the information that we have, then the policy is not going to impact, like a lot of things that we need it to even. So I kind of let that go. I'm like, the policy is not where we're going to start. It's going to be these companies. I've got access to them. Let's keep our conversations with them. Let's keep the channels of, a lot of people even, critique us like, why are you going to go talk to Facebook? Because we need to. We have to be there, And so I know that there are some self-righteous academics among us that are like, I'm not going to the belly of the beast. I'm like, all right, I'll go, damn it. I don't know why. Because these things are still happening. Like, we want them to get better. So let's have the conversations with them, Yeah. Thank you for asking that. Yeah. Yes. 2 hands in the back. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Okay, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Also,
I didn't mean to alarm. No moral panics in here. Nothing is no moral panics.
so my question is similar to Shimani's question. One thing I kept wondering about was whether the context of gaming specifically changes the sort of cultural shortcomings and forms of violence that we see. And one point, it sounded like the gaming industry attracts or like self-selects for the sort of culture because
sure.
Well, if we ban, then there won't be any gamers, right? But I was just thinking on a societal level, does it matter that this sort of behavior happens in the gaming sort of community versus on Twitter or social media?
Yeah.
And also, is there maybe 3 levels, right? Because there is the violence inside the game that people are like, oh, that's totally fine.
Sure.
It's not going to make people more violent. In fact, if they kill somebody in the game, they won't do it. So
I wish that were true.
and then there is the culture surrounding the name of the game.
Yeah.
Where the sort of violence happens and has.
Yeah.
And then there is sort of the public, which is, or social media in general, which is sort of a different thing.
Yeah.
Just wanted to ask you if you have thoughts on it or if you
that was a beautiful question. Thank you for asking that. I think it's important to just recognize that gaming is a microcosm of the world. Just like social media, anything digital is a microcosm of the world, right? There's only sexism online because there's sexism in the world. Patriarchy is a thing. Misogyny and misogynoir are things. And so they will manifest inside digital spaces. The same thing with gaming. And I think gaming gives us this really beautiful, I don't mean beautiful in that way, but it gives us this way to kind of dissect the soul of, we'll just say America, we'll stay in the United States context. It gives us a way to dissect the soul of the United States in a way to say, because early on, in my work, I really utilize this framework called online disinhibition, where online you can say and do things that you wouldn't do in physical space. That kind of went by the wayside, that's especially since the Trump era, we saw the return of a lot of this old-fashioned racism, old-fashioned sexism, where people felt empowered to say and do these things IRL, in real life, right? But I think whenever I did a deep dive for my book, Intersectional Tech, I did this deep dive to really try to understand white masculine anxieties in particular. Because a lot of the work that I did before, trying to understand racism and white supremacy, conversation about the alt-right and the alt-right on YouTube and stuff, I was like, this is not new, first off. And I didn't think that we had done a good enough job at tracking and marking the historical legacies. But I went down a deep dive, and I remember there were conversations in the 30s about how reading was, excuse the word, this was in the scholarship, it was leading to the sissification of our young boys and young men because we were asking them to read. So these conversations around like anti-intellectualism have always been there, right? I remember during the time, in the 80s, especially around like the death of like Vincent Chin. If you don't know who Vincent Chin is, you should know who Vincent Chin is. He was killed because there was a lot of anti-immigrant, xenophobic kind of conversations happening, especially around the displacement of workers and the displacement of like workers. And I don't want to say, I'm not even going to say displacement because that just assumes some kind of abstractness. You know, these corporations were moving companies to places that they could get cheaper labor, right? And so that was displacing like a lot of like the workers. And so those workers had to put those anxieties somewhere. And a lot of those anxieties led to them harming and hurting, you know, their brown and their Asian coworkers and counterparts. And Vincent Chin was like one of the ones who got killed. I think he worked at the Chrysler factory or the Ford factory, like in Detroit. My apologies for not seeing that. These, even the anxieties, even like around like the 50s, there was a crisis of masculinity when the war was over, and people were like, what are the men going to do now if they're not fighting? So then we've manufactured so much crisis to make sense of masculine anxieties without ever like addressing there's a problem with men. There's a problem with men. And we'll scapegoat the shit out of that conversation. We'll skirt around that issue all around. You know, even when we talk about like, so much violence in gaming, let's kind of get to the heart of it. You know, these are, even when we talk about like, violence like against women, there's like a culture of like violence that's just like endemic to the United States, probably globally, but I'm going to speak to the space that I know. There is something that with the conversation that we just won't have. And we'll get right there up until the point. We'll get right there and then we'll say, oh, it's video games that's doing it. And then we'll stop the conversation. Guns are the problem. Then we'll stop the conversation. We won't like go further like in that. So I wish I could say that there's something special to gaming. It's not. There's nothing special about gaming. Here we're just able to like identify because these folks are in a space where you can observe the inner workings. Like the conversations that I heard, like men are not okay. Boys are not okay. And there are not structures for them to like go and say, I don't feel okay. I want to cry. I didn't make that sports team. I'm not okay. My dad is whooping my ass at home. I don't know where to go. I got to be a man. I got to toughen it out. Like I've heard like so many of like those kinds of conversations in those spaces, and I can't do anything about it. That's like one of the most disturbing parts about doing all this work, which is why I had to stop doing work like with the alt-right. I had a lot of sympathies for these men, white boys and men who were doing a lot of harms like in the world and who had planned to do plans. They hadn't done anything, but they had plans in their minds to want to do all this harm because they were hurting. I'm like, I'm not set up for that. I wasn't set up for that kind of work. So that's also, if some of you have followed my work for a while, you know that there was like a juncture point where I went away from like a lot of that work and I just started focusing. I'm like, let me just focus on what Black folks are doing like in this space. I just want to see that. Nobody talked about that. Let's just do that. So I kind of went away from that because I'm like, I'm not equipped for that kind of conversation. Somebody needs to. And it needs to, of course, conversations in the home, conversations in school, basically the dismantling of, mental health services like in the world. Like that's really, if I really want to have a conversation like around that, that's where the conversation would start and that's where the conversation would end for me, But, I don't have like an infrastructure to talk about that. Nobody, and of course these platforms are like, Kishonna, we're not counselors, we're not therapists. I'm like, I get that, but I'm like, you could address some of this. I'm like, all those dudes, they're cheating because they feel that their masculinity has been tested and challenged. So they have to figure out a way to get the one up on people. So that's why they're cheating. That's why they're doing that, because they don't want to feel less than. They don't want to feel less than. It's probably more than you asked for. My bad. So sorry. Thank you for asking that question, though. My apologies. I know you had a question, and I know you've got to get to class, and okay. All right. Yes.
Thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. In a previous life, in my 20s, I tried to be a professional gamer. But then just quickly failed.
That's hard.
But like there was like StarCraft, I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
War Factory, all these very old games now.
Awesome.
But the reason I mentioned that is because those were chat based, right? Where you playing Team 4 or whatever, and like you would be playing over, and I was like, wow, these chats are incredibly terrible.
Yeah,
Right? They're
yeah,
so toxic, right?
yeah, that's right.
20% great and 80% just
Yeah,
like.
thank you so much. Thank you.
And so I absolutely agree with you that if you approach these companies, they don't want any records of anything because it produces liability.
Yeah.
And even if, and it produces liability they can't anticipate, right?
Right,
Because they don't know how this data will be used in the future.
That's right.
So there will be ways to find racism and sexism that we're not aware of today.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's another problem, when I approach these people, which is and again, I'm just using chat,
Sure.
trying to narrow the scope.
Sure.
A little bit, right? And maybe it's useful to think with. The vocabulary, the sort of nomenclature, the dialects that emerge in the gaming culture around a particular game, especially competitive games.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I'm not in the Counter-Strike world, but my God, right? Like it creates new ways in which one can be racist. Never be detectable to a crowd like this that have never played a game before.
That's right.
Right? And so
And the machines aren't even trained for it.
no, and how could you train a machine? Like
That's right. That's right.
These
That's
sort
right.
of ways of communicating and interacting, sort of affordances that the game provides.
That's right.
Are only sort of legible like within that sort of context. And so knowing those two things, like the descriptive like element is so these communicative environments are so sort of nuanced. Right. And on the other hand, knowing that liability is always constantly a thing that no company wants to take on.
They don't.
How have you in your own work approached you point out this problem, right? The problem of scale, right? How have you approached trying to convince companies to do something about this? Like, do you befriend them and say like, okay, I can try to help you, but I'm going to be like shackled right to NDAs and whatnot, or do you say, and maybe you don't know, but like I'm just asking how you thought about this, or the alternative is for like try to like throw rocks from the outside, but obviously you're very limited, so then you have to do it, right? So it's not either or.
Yeah.
Ask you to like sort of expand on how you approach this.
Absolutely.
I'm super excited to hear whatever you have to say.
Absolutely. Looking at the social media space, there's an example that I'll offer here in this space because, you know, a lot of those social media spaces that got really closed off, like with their data. And so there's like this group of these rogue academics, I mean, rogue in a very lovely way, but they were like, we can create our own tools and we can get the data ourselves. We don't need them. So there have been like some legal conversations of like, you know, is that okay, like for them to do? Like if these companies won't do it, like it's publicly available. And then we can just kind of develop like these tools. And so in my mind, the conversation that I had in that space, I was like, you know, I don't care much about these companies. I don't. But there was an example that happened. Somebody had scraped some data and there was this Black woman who was really vulnerable. It was around like the time of like the movement like for Black Lives. And a lot of her tweets, they were published in a publication and her username like was associated like with that. So in their quest to just make data publicly available and to like, you know, get stuff out there, there are some populations who are still vulnerable to that, right? And so here I'm like, okay, let's go stick it to the man. Let's stick it to the tech man. But then how do we protect like folks like in that way? So I don't have an answer like for that. But in that example, it made me like think about, you know, can we go around the system to then get access to these things? To answer your question, I don't know what to do. I'll say that. I've tried to develop relationships with these companies, tried to get them to like do the reading, but like even like for a company like Microsoft, I don't have a relationship like with Microsoft. Somebody said, I guess I threw too many rocks before, to use your metaphor. I threw too many rocks, and then they look at me as one that they don't want to like engage in like this relationship with now, which is fine, right? But I also think that I have become just so defeated. So I've been doing this work like a long time. Like I'm 40 plus now. I know I don't look it. I know I'm looking young and good. I know I look 20 years old. But I guess I'm tired. And so in that moment where I realized like these companies are not going to do much and my relationship will be very limited, because like you said, we'll be limited by what they're asking for. Let me give an example. the whole wave of DEI consultants, that kind of just took our nation by storm. The whole DEI thing. It was a failed project, by the way. It was a failed project then, but you couldn't really speak publicly about it because then the DEI spaces, that's where a lot of these companies got their diversity. It's where they were hiring women and people of color. So you couldn't really talk about it. But I'm like, we now know what DEI has become, right? So that's a conversation for a different day. Basically, under the scope of one of these things, they wanted my help at making their characters better, more diverse, more better. And so I wasn't a part of a design team. I wasn't at the ideation phase. Basically, they wanted me to just rubber stamp the thing that they created. I was like, hey, Dr. Gray, you like this? I'm like, okay, she's beautiful. Where are you going with this? What are you trying to do? I'm like, and so it didn't really seem, that was the limits to what the interaction, the engagements that they wanted, just so they could say, hey, Kishonna Gray said, we're good. So we're good, you know what I'm saying? So there I have been kind of identifying the different ways of integrating into that. That's a very superficial integration, if you will. The relationship that I have with Modulate, for instance, the Toxmod team, I'm in conversations with a machine learning team. They don't make moves. I meet weekly with them. And so there's this beautiful inclusion of me inside their teams. And then they're honest about what the limits are, what they can do, what they want to do, what they hope to do. And then they're transparent in that. I think that's the model that a lot of these companies should strive for, where they're transparent, they recognize their limits, but they're like, hey, we're trying something, we want to do something. And they realize that their efforts are very organic. Just because they do a thing, they're like, we can always go back and we can change and we can update, and we can admit, we can learn, we can be better and do better. That's what I wish that the model would then become. But I don't know how you get those folks inside there to kind of change their practices, because they're so closed off, especially after, Cambridge Analytica, a lot of them, they closed ranks. They really closed ranks. I think the fear was a fear narrative. A lot of lawyers advised them to be like, no, they close ranks. I get it. I get that. So I don't know. I don't know how to get in there. Yeah, it is 1:30, friends. It's 1:30. We're gonna have to make some moves. There's maybe a few things there. Thank you. Please shout out to our host, Chinmay. You're amazing. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
That part, which I knew you would be, but also being deeply compassionate.
Absolutely. Appreciate you. Thank you.